Viridian, The Green Guide, written by Clouds, read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 79, Moving Forward. Kotsky sat on the crumbling boardwalk and stretched as he waited for Shinso to show up. When he'd suggested the beach as a training location back after the entrance exam, he wasn't expecting to have almost died there. He'd had to practically fight his old hag to convince her to let him go out, but the doctor said there wasn't anything to worry about and his strength was already almost back to normal, which was more important than ever with classes beginning in a few days. There was no guarantee that Shinso was going to show his face, but hey, at least Kotsky was trying to pass it on, or whatever the redemption program wanted him to do, and he wasn't about to turn his nose up at some extra physical training so that he was ready to face the villain factory when he found them. If Shinso really wanted to be a hero, then it was up to him to put in the work. If he wasn't willing to do that, then that wasn't Kotsky's problem. This place is a mess. Kotsky glanced up and saw Shinso hesitantly picking his way across the rotting boards, nose wrinkled in disgust at the smell. Kotsky turned back toward the beach and scoffed, "Yep, one wrong move on these boards and you'll fall through, so watch where you step." "That's comforting," Shinso said wryly. "Why are we here instead of, I don't know, a normal gym or park? Wasn't there a villain attack here a couple days ago or something?" "Something like that." Kotsky clenched his fist, "but that just means it's more of a mess than usual, and we're here because it's good for training. If you can get used to being aware of where you place your feet to avoid falling through a boardwalk, then you'll be more aware of how and where to step on a rooftop to move silently or to avoid traps, depending on what you need. If you can get used to running on sand, then you won't immediately roll your ankle when you're faced with a street filled with debris. And if you build muscle hauling trash, then that'll help when you're taking down villains. Now come on, you're going to help me clean up this beach." Shinso raised an eyebrow skeptically. "Seriously? This whole beach? Are you actually insane?" "Probably," Kotsky shrugged, "but I don't think you have a whole lot of room to talk. You're trying to do the impossible too, right? Unless, of course, you did get into the hero course after all, and you're not counting on a Hail Mary through the sports festival." Shinso was notably silent. Not that he expected anything different, and Kotsky stretched. "Come on, let's get started. If we want to be heroes, we're going to need both mental and physical strength. All the determination in the world isn't going to be enough if any thug on the street can overpower you." He jumped down off the boardwalk and onto the sand, only to slip a little on the landing and ended up on his hands and knees. This sand was what had made the chase with Ogawa so damn difficult. When Shinso started laughing at him, Kotsky just brushed the sand off his hands and raised an eyebrow. "All right, you think you can do better? Let's see it." Shinso's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly rose to the challenge and jumped down after Kotsky. He didn't do any better. Kotsky's laugh echoed across the beach as he reached a hand down to help Shinso up. "Looks like we both have work to do, eyebags. Show me what you got." Dobby groaned and spread the pictures out in front of him again. He had pulled on every single one of his connections to get even this much, but it still seemed like things were missing. He could trace the villain factory's influence. He could figure out a few people they'd abducted, but there wasn't even a single clue as to where they were located or who the people behind them were. No wonder the police hadn't been able to find Endeavor in time. It was like trying to figure out what a puzzle was supposed to look like based only on the edge pieces. It didn't help that he was distracted by everything, really. He didn't know how he was supposed to feel about his siblings at this point, or even how he wanted to feel. On the one hand, it was their fault, and Shoto's fault in particular, that he'd been cast aside by Endeavor and forced to go beyond his limits just to prove himself. But on the other hand, they were still his family. They still had a connection and a shared history that he couldn't just erase. It made everything so much more complicated. Why couldn't he have just killed his old man like he'd always wanted? It would have made things so much easier. He kept telling himself that the articles he kept reading about the Todoroki siblings were evidence for his investigation, but even that excuse was starting to wear thin. Now that Endeavor was gone, the villain factory most likely didn't give a crap about the family he'd left behind, which meant that the only thing Dabi was learning from his research was that he was curious and stupid. He still kept reading the articles. Fuyumi had apparently taken custody of Shoto, and Natsu was old enough to be his own guardian, which was a hell of a lot better than Dabi had gotten when Endeavor cut him loose. Reporters kept bothering what was left of the Todorokis for tell-alls and exposés on Endeavor's abuse, but they'd apparently decided to try and put it behind them, because they never answered any of the questions. Dabi supposed that it was easier to forget, or at least pretend that they'd forgotten, than to face everything that the bastard had done to them. But that was a luxury that was really only available to Natsu and Fuyumi. It wasn't like Dabi or Shoto could forget what they'd gone through when the evidence of it was still branded onto their skin. Dabi shook his head and forced his attention back to the information in front of him, as he willed it to make any sort of connection. He'd hoped that there would be some sort of pattern to the disappearances, but the only thing he'd learned was that the villain factory was well connected enough to disappear anyone they set their eye on. Everyone from small-time crooks like Ogawa to the former number 2 hero had just disappeared one day, without a trace, only to return different or not at all. Trying to track down the villain factory was like trying to find Bigfoot. Maybe if Kachan were willing to work on the case, the two of them might be able to put their heads together and come up with something. He had a good head on his shoulders, but the heroes had somehow convinced him to wait until he got into the hero course to start investigating full force. It was really annoying, but there wasn't much Dabi could do about it except for be patient. He hated being patient. His staples started itching, which meant that he was probably tired and had been at this for far too long. But Dabi just rubbed at them and kept going. He wouldn't be able to get restful sleep anyway with all these questions buzzing around in his brain. So what was even the point in trying? He sighed and rearranged his notes again, his eye catching on an article announcing that his little brother was going to be in UA next year. Before he could think better of it, Dabi grabbed the paper and burned it to ash. The only thing his family had ever given him was pain. So what did he care if Shoto was really going to be a hero? He'd left that path behind a long time ago, so now the only thing to do was find the people who had taken Endeavor and give them a piece of his mind. Unlike perfect little Shoto, Dabi wasn't made to be a hero. Izuku hadn't seen any of his usual heroes in days, and it was starting to throw him off. Every night that he'd gone out, there was a different mix of heroes, and he was starting to get concerned. Why in the world was Mount Lady patrolling in Amplifier's usual area? It just didn't make sense. What had happened to Eraserhead and Amplifier? Even Rocklock should be out here, but he wasn't. Did it have something to do with the Berserker attack? Or, well, the not actually Berserker attack, but still, were they okay? With those thoughts in his mind, when he saw Eraser perched on the edge of a building, Izuku grinned in relief and bounced up to him. "Hey, Eraser, long time no see. Where have you been?" Eraserhead, for some reason, looked shocked. "Viridian, you're alive?" Yes? Izuku pouted. "I told you I wasn't trying to die anymore. I even stayed away from that tentacle monster. Don't you trust me?" "No." Eraser shook his head. "I mean, yes, you did very well. But when you didn't show up in any hospitals after the attack, we were worried and feared the worst. The rest of us were hit pretty hard by that poison. They just barely let me out of the hospital yesterday." Izuku tilted his head in confusion. "What poison?" Eraserhead raised an eyebrow at him and spoke slowly, like he thought Izuku was an idiot for some reason. "The poison the bees were filled with? You know, the massive swarm that descended on the beach like some biblical plague? Ring a bell?" "They were filled with poison?" Izuku exclaimed. He felt fine. Had the ones who stung him just been duds? Or was he about to drop dead at any moment? Should he go to the hospital? But Eraserhead had already pretty much recovered. So if it were going to affect Izuku at all, it would have already, right? Why would it affect Eraserhead and not him? Yeah, it was pretty nasty stuff. Eraser sounded exhausted. It latches onto the quirk factor, so we're lucky the hospital was able to get everyone the antidote in time. We think the berserker actually escaped, and the villain factory was just trying to tie off loose ends. We were pretty worried when you didn't ever show up to get medical attention. Oh! Izuku's mind raced. A poison that latched onto the quirk factor was unique. And the villain factory had most likely been hoping that it would degrade the quirk or quirks enough that it would be difficult to figure out what they had been trying to do. It was really concerning that they had access to a poison like that, but it explained why Izuku wasn't dead. But he couldn't really say that to Eraserhead without explaining the whole quirkless thing. Don't worry about me. I didn't get stung at all. I'm totally fine. Eraserhead narrowed his eyes skeptically. All those bees, and you didn't get stung once? I found cover, Izuku tried, and the bees weren't going after me anyway. They were trying to go after that well, it wasn't a berserker, so I see why they were trying to get rid of him. It's complicated. Eraser's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? What could he be other than a berserker? Well, according to what I dug up, he's kind of an amalgamation of several different quirks, maybe even different people, Izuku said hesitantly, grabbing the notebook he had prepared. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I noticed that the quirk seemed like it should be part of the next generation, like the child of the people the villain factory abducted. But that's not possible in the time frame we're working with. But from what I've learned about quirk transfer, I think it makes sense for one quirk to be mixed with other quirks during the whole transfer process. I tracked some of the abductions that were linked to the villain factory, and I'm pretty sure I know whose quirks they used. Eraserhead sighed in exhaustion. Of course you do. I don't even know why I thought you would take a break from almost dying. That would be intelligent. All right, then. Let me see what you found. Izuku handed him the notebook, and Eraserhead started thumbing through it. While he was distracted, Izuku silently stood up and faded into the shadows. He probably wouldn't have any better opportunity to get away, and he'd already passed on the important information that he needed. So, as soon as he got off the roof, Izuku ran to find another person to save. He hadn't died yet, so he was going to keep fighting. End of chapter.